Hello, everyone. Welcome to Renew US's programming. We are super excited for this upcoming year, 2023. There's elections going on across the US, even in an off year. And one of the things that we are really focusing on this year is organizing, getting deeper into organizing principles, really building these skills that we need to effectively make change in our communities. For those of you that don't know me, my name is Jen Brown. I am the education director here at Renew US. And I am especially pumped about this class today, requesting documents through the Freedom of Information Act, because when I actually had to request documents this year, I sent a panicked message to our Signal chat of how do I do this? And what do I do? And copy and pasted someone else's work, who I think copy and pasted it possibly from another person. So it is very exciting to actually learn a little more substance on this. And I'm really pumped to introduce Raul Pinto, who is an amazing resource. I've gotten to know him over the last few months talking about this class. So this is the last you're actually going to hear from me. And I'm going to pass it on over to Raul. Take it away.
Thank you, Jen. I don't think I've ever heard someone be so excited about FOIA work. So I'm really excited that you are that excited to talk about this particular line of work. As Jen mentioned, my name is Raul Pinto, and I am a senior staff attorney with the American Immigration Council. But within the American Immigration Council, I work for the transparency team, which does a lot of Freedom of Information Act requests, and so we've garnered some extensive knowledge about sort of the processes, the litigation that goes along with it, and really the goal has been to make the immigration agencies accountable for the policies that they are implementing and how they are impacting immigrants in the United States. So my experience in all of the things that I'm going to be telling you today are kind of in the context of the immigration landscape, but obviously the Freedom of Information Act applies generally to government agencies. And so a lot of the things that we are going to be talking about apply to much broader fights, right? So environmental agencies use the FOIA. I'll use the acronym so I don't trip over my words. They use FOIA in order to get documents to launch campaigns to get either greater protections or stop the rescission of other protections, and just to kind of know what the agencies are doing. One of the goals of the FOIA is that there is no secret law in the United States, that these agencies that are part of the executive branch don't get to just adopt policies in the dark. And I think that is super laudable. And I think it's a tool that is underutilized by groups in order to affect change. And so when Jen came to me and asked me to do this presentation, I said, yeah, this is going to be a great opportunity for and specifically sort of within the ambit of organizing as to how you do that more, how we take FOIA, take the information that we get in order to sort of build lasting change. The other thing that I will say is that this work is a little bit frustrating. Sometimes it takes a long time. Sometimes it takes negotiation to really get what you want. Sometimes it takes you just having to settle a little bit for what the agency has. I think there are frustrations that are inherent within this work and how this work progresses. The other issue that I think about is sometimes because of the length of time that this process takes, you start off with like a sexy, news item that is making the rounds and people are paying attention, and then it gets this 15 seconds of fame, and then all of a sudden is out of our consciousness. And because of FOIA takes a long time to materialize, sometimes the process can feel a little bit like it's just inherently outdated, and that you won't be able to get documents, and that is specifically true if you deal with immigration agencies as a whole. I don't necessarily know how we're doing questions, but I think the group is small enough where, if you want to just come off mute and just ask and interrupt, I think that'll be that'll be fine. And if not, if you're sort of inching to like to wait until the end to ask me questions, I think I'll leave off a couple of minutes at the end to also post questions. The one thing that I won't be doing, just because I'm running the slides, and I apologize for this, I won't be monitoring the chat very closely. So if there is discussion in the chat, I probably will not be able to see it. And Jen, unless you want to help me out here and monitor the chat a little bit and see if there's any interesting questions that I haven't addressed, I think that would be fantastic if you can do that, but I won't be addressing them sort of directly as they come through.
I just posted that I got you if it gets wild in here, and I will monitor the chat. Thank you so much.
The chats do get wild when we talk about FOIA. No, I'm just kidding. It's really not that exciting, but there is good work to be done. So let's get started. I hope you all can see my screen here, and we're going to start really with the legal framework, right? It starts with the federal law, which is the Freedom of Information Act. If there's any legals in the group, it's 5 USC 552. That is the number of the law. It says that any person has the right to access non-exempt federal government record. Therefore, any person has been interpreted to mean any individual. It actually also encompasses partnerships and corporations, and public or private organizations. I'll inject a little bit of the immigration side of things. It also includes undocumented folks, so it doesn't have to be U.S. citizens at all to take advantage of this law. And as a matter of fact, the most FOIA requests that are submitted to U.S. agencies right now are in the ambit of immigration, because for immigration purposes, the only way in which you can get your records, meaning the records of what you submitted to the agency, the records that you are going to be relying on, to defend against a possible removal or deportation, are through FOIA. So it doesn't work quite like the criminal system, where you have this automatic access to your file in a marbled wall court. Right, you kind of have to go through the FOIA and make a FOIA request. And as a matter of fact, the council has been doing a lot of work in trying to make the process of obtaining these records more expedient, because oftentimes, because of just the sheer number of requests that are being made, sometimes the wait times for these records can be fairly long. And we'll talk about sort of the wait times that you should be expecting. And definitely in different contexts, like for example, if you're looking at records from environmental agencies, if you're looking at IRS records, the wait may not be as long as the immigration side, because again, the sheer number of them. But basically, any individual, so anyone, or if you want to do it on behalf of an organization, if you want to do the request on behalf of an organization, that's cool too. What does it mean to have a government agency? And this is where sometimes it can get a little bit complicated, right? You have to know that only government agencies are subject to FOIA. So any executive department, we deal all the time with Department of Homeland Security, which is the department that executes the immigration laws in the United States. We also actually deal with U.S. Department of Justice, which is the agency that runs the immigration courts in the United States, right? But you also have the potential to include, the Environmental Protection Agency, Department of the Interior, Housing and Urban Development. So all of those sort of cabinet level departments are subject to FOIA requirements, which means that they have to make their records, their documents public. Military department, Department of Defense, for example, that's also another agency that would fall under the purview of FOIA. Government corporations, that is also another example, and we'll talk a little bit. And I don't have slides particularly talking about the state processes, but we'll definitely leave some time to talk about those. Government corporations in the states are very common. So, for example, a government corporation that runs a transportation system. If I believe that, for example, there's a corporation. I'm based out of Raleigh, Durham, and there's a corporation that runs the airport here in Raleigh, Durham. And so that corporation, if it's doing a public service, it would actually, if it's like sort of run by the government, it would actually be subject to these to these requirements. So government controlled corporations or other institutions within the executive branch of the U.S. government. So executive office of the president or any independent regulatory agency. And one of the most important cases that courts have to deal with are the Watergate papers, right? The Watergate papers were sort of presidential papers, office of the president that had records relating to Watergate. So for you historians out there, that's also sort of a good just a good reference point that the type of agencies that are subject to the FOIA.
Raul, I just want to jump in for just, I think you are putting it right here. It was the Arizona statute, which I am pretty familiar with, is not limited to executive branch records. The Fed Act only applies to the executive branch, ? From Michael Bryan in the chat.
Yeah, let's talk about where it doesn't apply. The FOIA applies only to federal agencies. Now, so it does not create a right of access to records held by Congress, and Congress is because there's exemptions to the latest legislative privileges, just a whole set of other rules that would apply to congressional communications and other types of congressional records. So what that means is there may be other ways to obtain those records. It's just that the federal law, the Freedom of Information Act, as passed by Congress, does not apply to those records. So, for example, if I wanted to see what Senator Tillis has been talking about relating to the Afghan parole program, which is an issue that we're working on, he is within his right to say, no, those are congressional records. We're not going to provide you with those. Those do not fall under the FOIA request. The courts, that's a constitutional issue, separation of powers, right? That it's completely independent from the executive branch, and therefore the courts are not agencies, except unless there are administrative courts that are run under certain departments. So, for example, as I mentioned before, the immigration courts in the United States are actually run by the U.S. Department of Justice, and therefore those particular courts could be subject to FOIA. And as a matter of fact, we have several requests to U.S. Department of Justice asking for records relating to certain policies that Department of Justice implemented as it was changing their protocols relating to COVID-19, relating to scheduling practices in the immigration courts. So because those administrative courts would fall under the headline of the agency, then that's why they come under the purview of the FOIA. So again, but if you're just, if you want to go to your state court and you want, records relating to your, if someone was prosecuted or criminal records, that falls under completely different laws. And that's why the last one is state or local government agencies. And again, we'll talk a little bit more about this later on in this discussion, but, if, for example, the North Carolina Department of Transportation decided to put a road, outside in my backyard, for example, and I want to ask for records of what the conversations were like at NCDOT in the discussions as to why they decided to put it in my backyard, I actually can't use FOIA to get those records. I really would have to look at state laws in order to obtain those records. Now, what I will say, and I guess the good news is that I'm fairly certain that just about every single state in the nation has a set of laws that allows for records to be made public. North Carolina has them, New York has them, every single state. It just depends on there's certain states that have more liberal laws and allow for greater access. I learned about a month and a half ago or so that Florida has some very strong public records law, and actually that has helped in bringing clarity to many of the issues surrounding the transportation of migrants from Texas and by Florida entities to Martha's Vineyard. If you all remember that controversy a couple of months back, Florida's sunshine laws, as they're called, are very strong and allow for greater access than in other states. Texas, on the other hand, is actually a little bit more complex in that there's different processes that are attached. And so sometimes if you're looking to get documents from Texas, it may be a little bit more difficult because they have different processes. For example, one of the things that I encountered in trying to get records on immigration detention, and specifically in immigration detention centers that were being contracted by localities, by counties in Texas, so some of these folks said, well, we have a process in which we can actually consult with our state attorney general as to what this, if this is a public record under the Texas law. And so that can be a little bit of a deterrent sometimes, because you don't want to go to court over those records, or, because this is going to be a tactic to delay the access to that information. And so that's something that you have to be cognizant about as you are thinking about state and local. Local governments, for example, will be, for the most part, held to the state law. I don't think that there's any way in which a locality can adopt ordinances that differ from the state laws. So, for example, in Texas, we actually made the request directly to either county sheriff's offices or the counties of themselves. Just to give you an example, we were very interested in a detention facility where the county of Williamson in Texas had contracted directly with pass-through funds from Immigration and Customs Enforcement to the county, and then the county would contract with a private prison company in order to detain immigrants held there. And so we went to the county of Williamson and asked them to provide us with whatever contract they had with the facilities. And so they provided us those records under state law. And also they also provided us with records, and we asked for any records relating to discussions that may have happened as to the renewal of these contracts and the adoption of these contracts. And they forked over a lot of information in emails about how that process went about, and even emails from constituency as well. So actually, one of the things that I should probably mention is that if you are contacting your elected official, if you are contacting an agency of the state, you may want to be careful what you put in there, because that actually may be subject to public record, and that and your name is generally not exempted, as we'll talk about exemptions and what the government can do to block access to some of this information. But for the most part, I think you have to be very careful sort of what you put in a public record. Here we had a little bit of a controversy about 10 years or so ago in North Carolina, where, for example, emails that were going to professors at the University of North Carolina, which is a public entity, whether that was public records, and we were sort of the mind that they were. We see journalists access text messages between coaches and in their contract negotiations, and so that can also be public records as well. So just be mindful of that as you are sort of developing advocacy strategies and as you're engaging with your elected officials. That's tip number one there. So what types of documents? I don't want to go through, because we can do probably a whole webinar on some of these exemptions. But the point that I'm trying to make with this slide is, just because you asked for records and FOIA provides you with the means to try to get those records, doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to get full access to these records. So here are what the law says is redacted, and I'll just highlight some of them just to kind of discuss some of these. But for example, record specifically B3, for example, and these are citations to the law, specifically exempted from disclosure by statute or other than FOIA. So for example, if there's another law that says you can't release those records, then the agency is going to redact and block off access to those records, right? We see a lot, for example, the interagency or intra-agency memoranda, basically the discussions about policies that haven't been implemented yet. I think that's another sort of example that we see a lot. Whereas basically what happens is the government wants their employees to kind of be free to discuss different policies, and so they have exempted sort of what's called a deliberative process from being a public record. And so we see that exemption a lot when there is discussion of certain policies that haven't been finalized yet. You could imagine, it's probably does not warrant a lot of discussion, but unwarranted invasions of privacy. So for example, if you really can't go look at the personnel file for a particular, let's say for example, Federal Bureau of Prisons worker, like you can't go into a personnel file. That could be an unwarranted invasion of privacy. B7 we see a lot as well, and for example, this obviously applies much more commonly to requests that are made of FBI, of Department of Justice, of some of the law enforcement agencies, but anything that would have to be compiled for law enforcement purposes. The law enforcement agencies don't like to give out their techniques for the obvious reasons, right? That if you give out too much information about your techniques, then folks are going to be able to circumvent those law enforcement efforts. So you get some roadblocks when it comes to that. And B8 and B9 are not commonly, I haven't seen them a lot. But you could probably make the case for the Consumer Protection Bureau that some of those regulations and those regulatory memos and records are not will not be privy to FOIA. What type of information is available? So any agency record, and that may include email, text, call logs, memos, etc. The agency is not required to create a record for you, though. So for example, let's say that you are writing a FOIA request because you want to know everything that the EPA has been doing for the past month or so, and you want all of the phone calls that were made between, let's say, January 1st of 2023 and January 11th of 2023. Okay, if the agency does not keep a log of those phone calls, then they are not obligated to create and go back and ask their officers to put time into remembering what phone calls they made and what was the content. So they are under no obligation to create a new record for you. I think this is coming up more and more as the government sort of is keeping databases and using electronic systems to input data, right? The agency can come back and say, look, we are inputting these documents into this system, and we don't necessarily have an Excel spreadsheet with all of the information that is going into these systems. And so they are, again, under no obligation to give you that, and they may try to use that. You have to push back a little bit sometimes. It's like, well, can the information be extracted from that system and be placed in a database? Then in that case, then you'd have a strong argument for the agency providing you with that information. So you got to be aware that could be a point of contention as you are going through these processes. And the agency then must provide information where request is reasonably described and made in accordance with published rules. And those are two very, very important tips. Each agency, be it the EPA, Department of Interior, as I said before, we deal a lot with Department of Homeland Security. They have published in the government's books, basically the Code of Federal Regulations. They have published and codified many of the requirements that folks and organizations need to have and need to meet before they make a FOIA request. So you have to look at those requirements, because if your request fails to meet those requirements, then your request is going to be denied. And so you have to really make sure that you kind of know those requirements. The council has come up with a great resource. We have a practice advisory. It's geared towards attorneys that are filing these all the time, but I think there's a lot of good information that can be gleaned from it relating to the processes that apply for immigration purposes. But we'll talk a little bit more about this as well. So I wanted to go into a little bit into the drafting of the FOIA request and specifically talking about the concise description of records. I tend to think about the requirement, and I'm going to go back for a second in my presentation, because the reasonably described is you really have to think about what you are getting at for two reasons. One is because you don't want to go into efficient expedition of everything that the government has. I mean, if you think about sort of text, emails, policy memorandums, all of the type of records that fall under the purview of FOIA, like that can get really, really complicated. And so you're going to be inundated with records that I'd say that 90% of them may not necessarily be helpful, right? You're going to have to sift through a lot of paperwork to get to a golden nugget. So it may not be the most efficient use of your time. So that's one thing. And then the second reason is the courts are really deferential to the agencies as to how much they will have to do in order to comply with your request. So it is better to be very thoughtful about how you are describing the records that you are seeking. And so that's why the concise description of the records is actually something that you have to be mindful of. And I tend to think about it. I have, like, my niece is now like in her 20s, but when she was like in her teens, right, it was like she you have to really give her like very specific instructions for her to do something. You want to give the agency very specific instructions. So I use like the teenager test, which is like you got to tell them, like, look in here. This is exactly what we're looking for. We're looking specifically for, this particular document. So like, we're looking for this particular memorandum, this particular, topic of conversations, this particular set of policies. And so that is something to keep in mind. And then the other sort of pitfall that I see folks make sometimes is you have to really think about who has those records, right? Because if they, if let's say, for example, that you are doing a request, and again, sort of putting it in the immigration context, but it is applicable to others, right? If I do a request for Department of Homeland Security for records that may lead to, for example, let's say I want records about the policies that Border Patrol uses when arresting an individual, and I make that request to Department of Justice, for example, they're not going to transfer that request over to the right agency. So you really have to think about which is the agency and even the subcomponent of that agency that may have the information I'm looking for. Many agencies have sort of sub-agencies underneath, and I can't give you a better example than immigration, right? You have the TSA, which comes under the purview of Department of Homeland Security, Customs and Border Protection, Immigrations and Customs Enforcement, U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services, among others. And so you really have to think about what is the agency, what is the sub-agency that has the record. Sometimes you can just get away with sending it to the general department, and that's okay. But if you can really zero in on the sub-agency and the subcomponent that may have the records, that's super helpful. If there's a particular agent, even if there's a particular name that you're looking for, then that's really going to give you a lot of a good head start for the agency to search those particular records. So just think about how you draft them. However, I will say that sometimes it is good to be over-inclusive, meaning that you really want to try to get at everything that the agency might have. So I actually provided in the presentation with the language that we generally use when we do a request for records. And so we wanted the definition of records to include just about everything that the agency can produce. So again, just to give you a little bit of legalese here, sort of all records or communications maintained in electronic or written form, correspondence, directives, data, videotapes, audio, emails, faxes, like anyone faxes anymore, but just in case, right? Files, guidance, guidelines, standards, evaluations, instructions, analysis, memoranda, agreements, notes, orders, policies, procedures, protocols, reports, rules, things like that. So all of that definition is in order for us to try not to miss anything, right? Because if, let's say, for example, that we ask them for all communications, and then they can come back and say, well, what communications do you want? Like, we had telephone calls, but those are not, we didn't keep records of those. And so we say, well, you have the definition in front of you, use it. Basically use the types of documents that we have listed for you. Sometimes this could be meaningless, but sometimes it could actually be very helpful, because it does cover a wide spectrum of types of records that can be out there. Again, sometimes it's better to actually, zero in, right? And so, for example, if I'm looking for a specific memorandum, like I want any memos that were issued by the agency in 2022, then I wouldn't necessarily use this definition, and I would say specifically memorandums. But if you have a particular topic in mind rather than a particular document in mind, then that's when you're going to have to play those two things and balance those things out. So just keep that in mind as you are making requests. Fees. So the agency can charge you some fees for their search. They can charge for search, copying, and reviewing the documents, because they'll have to look at the documents first. And then what they'll do is, as they're reviewing the documents, they will then redact and make redactions and keep any language out of what they give you. Requesters should include a statement of willingness to pay fees up to a limit. That sometimes, as the agencies are shifting to a more electronic model, this is sort of automatic. We usually set a limit and say, look, we were going to pay you for any of these fees that apply for up to $25. And if it's beyond that, you let us know. And so that goes to my second point here, which is that the agencies may contact a representative if fees will exceed that amount. So I think also, just going back to the drafting of your request, you got to make sure that you are including a date in their request, just so they can you can keep track of it and they can keep track of it, specifically if there's follow-up. So you got to include that date. You're going to include whether you're going to pay fees or not as well. The one thing that I will add, though, and this is how it happens regularly, is that if the agency doesn't comply with the time limits, and we'll talk about the time limits in a second, then no fees apply. So you don't have to pay anything if they don't reply within the time allowed by the law. And just be mindful that sometimes, if you are doing a request that is very broad, so let's say, for example, that I'm sending a request to Department of Homeland Security for anything that dealt with the withdrawal from the U.S. military withdrawal from Afghanistan, right? That may be a huge set of documents, and so the agency may come back and say, look, searching through these, combing through them, redacting where redactions are necessary under the law, that's going to be thousands of dollars. And so that can have a chilling effect. And there's some negotiation that can happen. And that rarely happens, because usually agencies are very good about allowing you to sort of know what the fees are going to be ahead of time. Narrow, they don't want to give you, thousands upon thousands of pages. Narrow, you want to narrow the request as well. But fees can have a chilling effect on obtaining some records, specifically when that bill can run up to thousands of dollars. But I think that can be negotiated. If you work for a nonprofit organization, or if you're doing the request on behalf of a nonprofit organization, always think about a fee waiver, and the language for a fee waiver has to be included in the original request. So as you're making the request and as you're writing sort of what you're looking for, you got to include in that letter a second section that will address fee waiver factors. In order for you to get a request, to get a fee waiver, you have to show that the information you're seeking is going to contribute significantly to public understanding of the operations or activities of the government. And so you have to meet both of these elements, disclosure of the information will not primarily be in the commercial interest of the requester. So for example, to meet the first bullet point, we usually include documents, or rather we usually include statements and proof that our organization has provided information in the past, that there's a lack of information about the particular processes by which we're seeking information. So for example, going back to the Afghan, right now, for example, we're seeking information about the Afghan parole program, right? And so we've said, look, there's not a lot of public information out there about how the Department of Homeland Security is running the parole program for special permission to enter the United States for people who are Afghan nationals who supported the U.S. mission in the country. And so, we've pointed out to examples about how people have been treated unfairly, and how, for example, people have applied for this particular travel permission but have not received it, or just have been pending for a while. So we included that kind of information about how your request is going to enhance the public knowledge about this issue. And then to meet the second point, we usually add information about that we are a nonprofit, 501c3, and that our website, the information that we collect is shared out through reports and other means that we don't charge for. And so it really does is really in your benefit to sort of include that language from the very get-go. What you want to do in a request is actually set up yourself so that if the request is denied in any way, shape, or form, then you can actually go to court on it. So that's something that you are doing as you are looking at your request, because all of this can be enforced through the courts. And we'll talk about that in a little bit. So what to expect after you file. And again, this sort of depends on how you've submitted your request and what the agency's rules are on submitting requests. I will caveat this by saying that all agencies have different processes. They can be similar, but they have some quirky differences that can often make your life give you a little bit of a headache, so life harder. So just be aware of the rules of the agency where you're going to be seeking documents. But as I said before, many of the agencies, and like I said, in my experience, the immigration agencies are going to a electronic portal process, which is basically you go into this website. And if you go on FOIAonline.gov, I believe is the website, there's a list of several agencies that fall into this category that you may be able to request records using this portal. And then you enter all the information in the portal, and then you start getting notifications as to your request via email. And as a matter of fact, if you are under that process, then you'll also be receiving the results of your FOIA request via that portal and via email as well. So that's something to keep in mind. It's easier for certain agencies, and certain immigration agencies actually are very easy to get through the portal, but it's not the only way. And sometimes it's actually recommended that you do it the old-fashioned way, which is through a snail mail. We utilize that all the time. Immigration attorneys use that all the time because the portals sometimes are glitchy. They don't give you a response back, and so snail mail sometimes works just as well. The one thing that I will say is that most of the time, what you will get back is a confirmation. Even if you do it by mail, a confirmation that your request has been received, and the agency will assign that request a number, and with that number you'll be able to track what the agency is doing to that request. So basically, there will also be a notification that comes to you after that receipt notice, saying what the agency is going to release and what it won't release, and the reasons for not releasing the records. Then you also get a notification with your right to appeal and a statement of reason for charging fees. Okay. Let's talk about the timelines. The timeline for response to a request is 20 business days. So from the moment that an agency has received your request, that agency has 20 working days to respond to your request. Okay. What happens often, very often, and in the immigration world and in other agencies as well, because they have gotten bogged down with a lot of requests, that the federal law provides them with an extension of 10 days if the request is complex. And at least in the immigration world, and maybe some of you know sort of from your experience in other agencies, they will just about 100% of the time apply this extension. So you're looking at about 30 days, 30 working days again. And so that's the time that they have to respond. Now, a response, though, you got to be careful, because the response is not necessarily giving you the documents, but rather sort of telling you what they are going to do with your request. So they could say, for example, we have found nothing that is responsive to your request. And that could be the answer, right? And so you'll have to strategize about what to do. What are your next steps there? They could also say, we're going to release these documents and not release these documents. And that also could be the agency's answer to your request. Or it can just give you the documents. If the agency actually has replied, it does not necessarily have to give you all the documents immediately. It can actually give you documents later on as well. So just to kind of curb your expectations a little bit, you don't necessarily have to get all those documents within 30 days, but rather it could be staggered a little bit there. So that's just your expectations and the timelines that we talked about before. Again, this goes back to the determination, and it also talks about sort of the timelines, 20 days. And then, but there is a requirement under the law that the records after the determination have to be made promptly available. Well, there's litigation about what that means. And it just depends as to the courts. Again, the courts are going to be very deferential to the government, but for the most part, you should be looking at records fairly soon after you make the determination. In the immigration world, I can tell you that we usually get a response with records within that time. If it's a complex set of records, and if it's a lot of information, then we usually what will happen is they'll say, well, we're going to give it to you in batches. So we'll produce 500 pages this month, we'll provide 500 pages the next month, and so on until we actually get a complete complete production of the records you're seeking. Referrals, sometimes the agencies will send records from one agency to another. Not all agencies do this. As I said before, specifically if you're in the completely wrong agency, so I wouldn't rely on an agency referral to get from the incorrect agency to the correct agency. So just be on the lookout for that. But for example, if you're looking at a record from Immigration and Customs Enforcement, right, and you send it to them, but it was really a USCIS, meaning Citizenship and Immigration Services, which is the sub-agency, then they may refer it to one another. But just be on the lookout that may not always work if you have the wrong agency there. Now, and this is where it gets very specific, and we're going to get into a little bit of a minutia here, but FOIA does allow for the agency to give you a right to appeal your request if you're not happy with the results, to appeal it internally before you are able to get to court. So agencies have to make the determination within 20 business days, as we mentioned before, 10-day extensions, and then you have to be provided the right of appeal, meaning that you can appeal, for example, if they deny your fee waiver. If they made an exemption, so for example, they redacted some information from the document that you requested that you don't think applies. So for example, let's say, if we go back to the list of exemptions, right? And they said, this falls under exception B9, which is that never happens, but I'm just giving you an example. Like, this is the geophysical exemption. And you say, well, I didn't ask for any geophysical information about wells here, so clearly this is the incorrect exemption. You can actually appeal that decision to the agency itself. And as a matter of fact, each agency has what are called liaisons that can help you sort of figure out the appeals process. But again, going back to the main point before, which was, hey, you really have to know those regulations, and you really have to know those processes before you file, because filing that appeal is going to depend on those rules. So for example, it just depends on the timeline, for example, will depend on those rules. So if I'm appealing the determination of a Department of Homeland Security FOIA request that I filed, I'm going to have 90 days, calendar days, to file that particular appeal. And you don't have to write a legal brief to do it, but you do have to explain why you think that they made the wrong determination, okay? And this is important because if you want to get to, if the agency has given you an answer and you want to get this to a court of law to review your denial and to try to force the agency to give you these documents, this process is a must. Like, you have to do it. Otherwise, the court is going to say, you didn't meet all of the requirements before filing this lawsuit, therefore we're going to just kick you out of court. So literally, they're going to kick you out of court if you, well, not literally, but you know what I mean. They're going to take you out, take the case out until you actually meet this requirement. So just be on the lookout for that. But the last thing that I will say about this topic is, if the agency has not responded within that time, you don't need to appeal that non-response. It happens all the time with immigration because of the backlogs. They will likely not meet that 20-day requirement or even 30-day requirement. And so I don't need to appeal that to take them to court. Then it becomes sort of a tactical question as to what you want to do. Do I want to take them to court right away? Do I want to give them a little bit more time to possibly work it out and see if they give me the records that I want? That may be up to you. So litigation, I don't want to go into too much details here because we want to get into the sort of the basics. We're doing basics here of the request, but you basically have to go to the U.S. District Court of where you live. There are certain requirements, but it could be the request where the requester lives is one potential option. You can, if the excuse me, if the agency is in Washington D.C. Then the DC District Court is actually another option. If it's a company where the company has a place of business, the law does give you several options as to where you would be able to file this lawsuit. But here's the good part about going to court. The responsibility of showing that they didn't break the law, or that they didn't that they complied with the law, is on the federal agency. So it's on the federal agency. So that's the good thing is that it's up to the federal agency to show why they needed to comply. As I was saying before, the courts give a lot of weight to the agency's explanation as to why they didn't comply, and and this is getting into the litigation requirements, but they must answer the complaint within 30 days, and because typically it's 60 days. So I think that is all I had. The one thing that I will say, a lot of the state laws sort of mirror this scheme. They differ in sort of in exemptions. Some like I said are more liberal than others as to the types of documents that they exempt. One of the biggest differences that I've least experienced is in the realm of the time that they should be responding. So FOIA is very clear. You got to respond within 20 days. If it's complex, 30 days. In North Carolina, for example, the North Carolina state law says that they can respond within a reasonable amount of time. And so that leaves a little bit of again, strategy decisions that you have to make, because what does that actually mean? And so if I file a request today, does that mean that I have to wait 2 weeks, a month? What is a reasonable time? We don't know. I think that question depends sometimes as to like what is the size of the production and the documents that are being produced. If you're looking for one particular document, for example, it's going to be much more reasonable to say, hey, we should probably be getting this by next week. If you're looking for every single record on a particular topic from the North Carolina Department of Transportation, much less likely that you're going to be getting it within a week. I will say that because of the differences between state law and federal law, it's sometimes easier to get stuff from state. It's sometimes easier to get stuff from your local sheriff's office, for example. We've done, I've personally done requests to local sheriffs on their policies about things, on their manuals about things. And sometimes because they don't necessarily deal with this kind of requests and transparency issues all the time, they can they'll just give that to you. Now, the other thing that you have to be on the lookout for is that the state laws can also differ on costs and what they can charge and whether there are fee waivers available. So, for example, we ran into this problem in Louisiana when we were doing some requests under Louisiana state law. And the sheriff there, one of the sheriffs that we requested documents from, he said, well, it's going to cost you about $200 to get this this contract that you want for us to produce. And we said, well, can you lower that fee? And we went back and forth and negotiated a little bit, but he didn't budge. The other thing is, you don't need to be an attorney in the state. In many, and I don't remember any laws that require you to be an attorney to submit a request. It's usually anyone. I thought if I recall, there's I think maybe the law in Mississippi or something like that maybe required you to be a resident of the state, but I'm not 100% sure. But that's something you have to look out for if you're doing, for example, a request in in a state where you don't live and you want documents from that state and you want it under that state law. They may require you to show that you are a resident of that state. So the definitions can vary. But these two processes are not mutually exclusive. You can do a FOIA request to the federal agency and Department of and the local agency. So just to give you an example, when I used to work with the ACLU of North Carolina, and we were doing an investigation about the sheriff's office and its cooperation with enforcement agencies. And so we did a FOIA request to the law enforcement agencies and said, we want to know every communication that you've had for the last year with this particular sheriff. And we also did a state records request to the sheriff and said, we want to know every communication that you've had with the immigration enforcement. And so, we play them off each other, and sometimes you'll be surprised as to, like, one agency may not give you the same information than the other, and vice versa. So those two things are not mutually exclusive. I would encourage folks that where there are sort of overlaps to do both. And I think that's the gist of it. That's what I have. I think I went a little long because I wanted to leave a little bit more time for questions, but yeah, I'm happy to field any questions that you all may have, and specifically, I'd love to hear some ideas as to how you're brainstorming about using this for organizing purposes as well.
Thank you for that. And if folks have questions, feel free to just pop off mute. Since we are a small group, totally manageable. Drop in the chat or pop off mute if you have any questions. And I will also say there's not a pressure to ask questions, because I know sometimes with these, you're like, I have so much information in my brain right now. So people can also send me questions and I can send them along. And if Raul has time, we can grab an answer.
Yeah, I'm actually also putting my email in the chat. So you can just email me with questions. Like I said, we focus in on the immigration context, but if anything, we think anything sort of overlaps, or we can answer on those. We're very concerned about transparency sort of in general, and can probably put you in the right direction. Another good resource for using transparency as an organizing tool, Center for Constitutional Rights. My friend Ian Head there also they've developed a lot of resources for our community as well. I see a hand up.
Hey, thank you so much. Dan Rose from North Carolina, Winston-Salem. One of our tips that we received was, after getting a FOIA request, or even after sending it, send another request for any communications about the FOIA request. Is that something that has ever borne fruit, or something you all have ever tried in terms of maybe seeing what they are saying about your FOIA request, if they're trying to hide the ball somewhere, or, you know, if there are tips that you get from those communications about, well, we could give him this, but not that, or he didn't ask for this, or he should have phrased it this way if he wanted that, you know, is that ever, do you think that might ever be helpful?
We haven't used that strategy. And if the groups are interested in that discussion and in those factors as to what it went into, I think it can. It's not always the case, and so that's probably why we haven't necessarily used it. I would also think that, you know, for FOIA purposes under the federal law, I think some of those discussions could fall under the deliberative process a little bit. And so I wouldn't be surprised if they redact some of that information. But as we were saying, sort of under state law, that you may be well entitled to those communications. And if that's what's going to help you, I don't see why not. Yeah, for sure.
I don't know if you spotted the one in the chat. Leah is asking, thank you so much for this. Is there a template example request document online that we could refer to?
Not really, because every request is going to be different. And as I said before, like I provided in the presentation sort of the template language definition of records, but for a particular request, you may want to zero in on a particular document. And so you can take I mean, you know, if you do a Google search for, you know, records requests submitted, you know, by environmental groups, by, you know, by the American Immigration Council, by CCR, I'm sure that you'll find, you know, samples that have been provided in the past. But, you know, as you start writing your own, you'll be like, that's not going to work for me. That we're going to have to edit that, or we're going to have to change that a little bit. So that is, yeah, it will be difficult to kind of come up with sort of a particular template.
I just dropped in the chat, there is a nice, like, it walks you through on the FOIA website. So maybe you could adapt something from there too, using the tips from Raul, just because you're like, it is a lot of stuff that you're like, this doesn't work for me. This is not going to work, right? But that's a good, like, follow the steps sort of thing. Awesome. If anyone else has questions, speak now or forever hold your pieces. And otherwise, we are I would love everyone just to drop some thanks in the chat. This was a ton of information that was really good, and I hope does help folks organizing. Keep an eye out if this is your first program with Renew. We're going to be doing a lot more stuff about organizing. Next up looks like how to write an op-ed. We're probably going to be working with Prism on this, which we're really excited, and really like strengthening our organized toolbox. Yes, Lisa, totally, as a cohort, definitely you can share it with other folks. I will get this sent to folks afterwards. And Raul, thank you so much for your time and energy today. I really appreciate it.
My pleasure. Thank you all so much for being here. Really appreciated it.
All right, have a great day and take good care of yourselves.
Thank